Professor Tim Murithi, head of the Peacebuilding Interventions Programme at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. Thank you very much indeed for joining us and welcome.
Thank you for having me on the program, and hello.
All right, let's talk about this issue that's come up as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We've seen African countries being forced and perhaps pressure being put upon them to pick sides in this conflict. The West saying things like that African countries need to uphold international rules-based order. I wonder from an African perspective, is there such a thing as a rules-based order?
That's a very important question, Peter, and I think we need to continue asking ourselves that question. And you're absolutely quite right that both the West and the East are, in fact, putting pressure on African countries to pick a side on the Russia-Ukraine crisis and conflict. And many African countries have been saying, in fact, we should rather be looking for ways to promote peace and to lay the foundations for peace building. And African countries have been accused of not upholding the international rules-based order. And in fact, even Emmanuel Macron in July 2022 last year accused African countries of hypocrisy and not naming the war and declaring who had started it. And you, as you're aware, many African governments, particularly in the capitals, have been under tremendous pressure from both the West and the East to take sides on this particular issue. And what we find is many African countries are arguing that the international rules-based, so-called international rules-based order has in fact not served Africa's interests. And African countries, in fact, have been on the receiving end of quite a number of military interventions, coalitions of actors, including NATO, and so on and so forth, who have, they've intervened militarily on the African continent, sometimes in contravention of the rules of international law, of the United Nations Charter. And African countries have been arguing that this rules-based system has worked for some and not for others. And in fact, African countries have been on the receiving end of power plays on the African continent, the United States, the UK, France, Russia as well, through mercenaries like the Wagner Group. And so the critique is that the system, in fact, is not really working for countries in the global south, including countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Middle East, and that we, in fact, need to interrogate whether this is a rules-based order that has been consistent throughout. We know in 2011, for example, NATO bombardment of Libya that was led by the US, Britain, and France, in fact, almost upended or undermined a mediation effort that was going on and being led by the African Union that unleashed chaos, not only in Libya, but in the G5 Sahel and across the Western African region, now threatens to seep down into the coastal countries of Africa, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Togo. And so African countries have been arguing that this so-called international rules-based order has in fact failed to intervene, particularly in contexts where African countries have faced major atrocities, the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. We had in 2005 a similar genocide in Srebrenica in the Balkans. In 2009 in Sri Lanka, the Tamil region was affected by the government that was attacking, the people there, and the sequence that we've seen in the Ukraine with the 2008 Georgia invasion by Russia, and then the 2014 annexation of Crimea is a pattern leading up to the 2022 conflict in Ukraine, which in fact is where now we're at a global inflection point where the system is really begin to collapse on itself. In fact, Russia was the president of the UN Security Council in February 2022, when it began to invade Ukraine with a tremendous chaos and damage that has been inflicted on that country, noting the women and children who've been severely affected by this ongoing conflict. So Africa's argument is that if we are really serious about the so-called international rules-based order, then we need to actually do much more to make it a genuine, inclusive system of global governance and democracy. Peter.
All right, we'll talk about what that new order might look like, but perhaps give us some examples, and you might have given us some clues already about times the West has seen us abuse the international rule-based order.
Yes, of course, there's quite a number of instances. I think we can go back to 2003, the US-UK-led invasion of Iraq, which in fact the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, from Ghana, quite openly said was an illegal act in terms of international law. You remember the US lobbied quite heavily at the United Nations Security Council, claiming there were weapons of mass destruction, which were never found in Iraq, and the country was subsequently destroyed, spawning, movements such as the ISIS, which are now also undertaking incursions in Africa, in the West Africa region, and also in East Africa through the Al-Shabaab. We have examples of Afghanistan as well, where there was an incursion by a coalition of forces, also under contentious international law framework, right? So this pattern has been repeating itself, and we begin to see that, in fact, the system itself, the international system of international collective security, is actually breaking at the seams. The order is not really working, particularly for middle and small countries that don't have the power to actually repulse the incursions by these powerful global actors. And most of them, in fact, are the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, US, UK, France, Russia, China. And in fact, they almost are converting the UN Security Council into a UN Insecurity Council. And so we have to be concerned as global citizens, as citizens of Africa, citizens of other parts of the world, that the system of collective security is now dysfunctional, is no longer working in the interests of ordinary people. In fact, I would say the majority of people, because it's really serving a very small group of powerful countries, the P5, who have shown that they are prepared to actually abuse it to achieve their own foreign policy and military adventures in various parts of the world, Peter.
All right, so I suppose that also leads us then to the solutions. And you've mentioned the Security Council. I suspect that when African countries propose a new order and reform, that's one of the areas to start. But what else?
Yes, I think we need to focus on the Security Council because it is is one of the most powerful institutions within the United Nations system. And it has the power to authorize an intervention in countries where the crisis, in fact, the appropriate language from the UN Charter is that it has the right to intervene in situations where there's an international threat to international peace and security. And this system was established in 1945. It's been almost 78 years in which we haven't had a genuine effort to review and reform and transform the system. So we do need to look at the UN Security Council as one of the institutions that really needs to be looked at quite closely. I mentioned before, Russia was sitting as the president of the council while it was in fact undertaking its illegal invasion of Ukraine, which goes to show that the system is quite fundamentally broken. And, a very specific issue that we need to look at is to, in fact, call about the convening of a conference, a general conference to review the United Nations Charter, which is stipulated quite clearly in Article 109 of the United Nations Charter. And in fact, the article states that 10 years after the establishment of the United Nations, this general conference was supposed to have been convened in 1955, but we are at 78 years later, and in fact, nothing has happened to genuinely convene this conference and actually put different views from different parts of the world on the table. And African governments have been arguing for almost 18 years. Since 2005, the African Union came up with a very clear statement of how it would like to see the United Nations Security Council reformed through its so-called Ezulwini consensus. But now we're at a point where we, in fact, need to go back to the drawing board and have a much wider conversation about what the future of international collective security looks like to ensure that the interests of all of humanity and not just the interests of a few are actually protected by the newly emerging system that we shall develop going forward. And I think what's important is that there's a summit of the future, which is happening, in a few months' time, that we need to also channel some of these ideas into, to say that, yes, we need to actually look at root and branch transformation of our United Nations system, our collective security system, so that we can actually pursue the goals of peacemaking and peace building that were promised in 1992 through the Agenda for Peace, as was drafted by Boutros Ghali of Egypt. So there's a lot of work to be done in this regard. I think there will be many questions about how, in fact, this can proceed and what sort of system that we might be able to put in place. But these are all questions that a general conference that I mentioned could actually help us to get the conversation going in terms of including governments, also civil society, unions, international, actors, and so on and so forth, to get this process on the cards, so to speak, Peter.
Professor Tim Murithi, head of the Peacebuilding Interventions Programme at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. Thanks very much indeed for your time.
Thank you very much, Peter.